As Iran's entire military infrastructure crumbles, all it has left are missiles and drones, the latter of which it's still using to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. The US has had enough. F-15E Strike Eagles have taken flight, and they're doing something huge to reopen that vital waterway. The F-15s are beyond unstoppable. That's going to make the Strait of Hormuz blockade impossible. This is precision domination that is leaving Iran desperate as its production facilities are shattered. So desperate, in fact, that Iran is begging for an end to Operation Epic Fury and has been reduced to lying about the very fighter jet that the US has unleashed. But we'll get to all of that later, so stick with us until then. The big news is that the US has moved into a new phase of aerial strikes against Iran, and the F-15 is right at the center of that phase. With air defenses destroyed and missile launch sites being picked off as soon as they're detected, the US has moved from ruining what there is of Iran's military infrastructure, and it has now turned its sights toward what could be. Iran's military may be in tatters, but as long as its production facilities still exist, the regime could rebuild. That's where the latest F-15 strikes come into play. Leading a strike force that includes F-35s and B-1 bombers, America's F-15s are destroying Iranian production plants left, right, and center. Coast Reporter has noted this, pointing out that the Israeli Defense Forces have claimed that it's conducted a series of strikes against what it simply calls production sites in Iran. No more information was given, but the US is taking part in those strikes as part of Operation Epic Fury. And there is one strike in particular that shows that America's part in these attacks is all about opening up the Strait of Hormuz. As command and control centers burn, warehouses go up in flames, and military facilities building components explode, the US has zeroed in on Iran's Shaheed drone production to ensure that the country's regime can't build more of the unmanned aerial terrors that it's been using to assault merchant ships attempting to sail through the Strait of Hormuz. We saw just how effective these strikes have been on March 24th, when the news broke that US air power had destroyed a drone engine manufacturing plant in the city of Qom. That factory built the turbojet engines that are used in Iran's Shaheed drones, along with other aviation components, making it a vital facility for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, which is causing so much chaos in the strait. Militani provides the before and after, noting that satellite pictures taken on March 6th showed that the plant was still intact and operational. Fast forward to today, and it's gone. Nothing more than a crater in the ground after a likely F-15 took it out. What we're seeing here is the US moving into a new phase where it takes out drones that provide Iran with the means to fight back, albeit in fits and spurts, during Operation Epic Fury. These drones aren't only targeting ships, though we'll get to why the Strait of Hormuz problem is the one that the US really wants to solve in a moment. They're also being launched at other Gulf nations, particularly those that have good relationships with the US, and they're causing such major problems because of how cheap they are to produce. NPR explains, noting that Iran spends between $20,000 and $50,000 to build a Shaheed, depending on the specific model it's making. America's F-15s could be deployed to intercept these cheap drones after they're launched, as could ground-based air defense systems. In fact, they both have been. However, using expensive missiles to take out cheap drones isn't the sort of maths that makes sense if the US is expecting a protracted campaign against Iran. And the US certainly can't allow Iran to build enough Shaheeds to allow it to launch them in massive swarms against the Gulf states and the Strait of Hormuz. And swarms are what Iran has been unleashing, even as the US whittles away at the country's drone launch sites with its attacks. The first week of the operation saw Iran fire off over 1,000 drones against Gulf states and merchant ships. There have been many more since, and Iran was believed to have the capacity to build 10,000 Shaheeds each month before the war began. The US doesn't have 10,000 Patriot and other interceptor missiles. Even if it did, using a $4 million Patriot to shoot down a $20,000 to $50,000 drone isn't how the US puts itself in a position where it can sustain Operation Epic Fury for as long as is needed. So what has the US done instead? Rather than using dozens of expensive missiles to take out Shaheed drones directly, it's attacked the means of production with those same missiles. Now that its turbojet manufacturing facility in Qom is out of the picture, a key part of the Shaheed supply chain has been ripped apart. The US and Israel will continue hitting production facilities, and with each strike, that supply chain will get weaker until it's gone altogether. At that point, it won't matter how cheap the Shaheeds are for Iran. All it will be left with is its existing stockpiles with no means of producing any more. But as we've mentioned several times already, it's not just keeping interception costs low that's on America's mind, as it uses its F-15s to target Iran's drone production facilities. Opening up the Strait of Hormuz is right at the top of the US priority list. Almost as soon as the US launched Operation Epic Fury, Iran responded by launching attacks against merchant ships attempting to pass through the strait. Beyond the drones, Iran has also been using fast boats, which are little more than speedboats loaded with weapons or explosives, to blow holes in merchant ships. At least 16 commercial vessels have been hit in the strait so far, which is concerning enough. Far more worrying, from both the US and the global perspective, is that the Strait of Hormuz is a very important waterway. About 20% of the entire world's oil and liquefied natural gas passes through this strait every single year. Iran's creation of a blockade lays the foundation for a global energy crisis, and we can see that in the fact that oil prices have rocketed up to around $120 per barrel and stayed around that point ever since the US launched the operation. The Strait of Hormuz is Iran's trump card. Shaheed drones are what it needs to keep producing if it's to play that card effectively. Iran's Strait of Hormuz blockade has been successful precisely because it isn't following the traditional rules for a blockade. The strait isn't being filled with massive warships that stop merchant vessels from passing. Instead, Iran is firing off sporadic anti-ship missiles, deploying fast boats, and launching drones that target the ships that attempt to pass. All of this is done to persuade merchant ship captains to view the crossing as too risky to attempt. Sure, they might make it through, or they could end up with holes in their hulls. Iran's strategy has been so effective that more than 1,000 ships have been blocked from entering the Strait of Hormuz as of March 16th, with many of those ships still idling near the strait in the hope that safe passage can be secured. That situation is made possible in part by the fact that Iran can produce thousands of Shaheed drones per month, or it could. With no turbojet engines, Iran's Shaheed drones aren't going to get very far. Plus, as the Al Jazeera Center for Studies points out, it's not just destroying the means of production that the F-15 excels at. The fighter jet can also redeploy to the Strait of Hormuz to disrupt cruise and ballistic missile launches across the strait, in addition to taking out Shaheed drones and other anti-ship weapons. F-15s may even be tracking Iran's fast boats and mine-laying vessels, essentially turning them into an aerial shield against the very measure that Iran can muster to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. And it's no wonder the US has chosen the F-15 for all of these strikes. It's the perfect fighter for the job. Though not a stealth fighter like the F-35, the F-15 is a tactical all-weather fighter jet that is extremely agile and offers an immense combination of speed, range and weapons, able to hit speeds of 1,875 miles per hour, which places it in the Mach 2 class. It has a range of 3,450 miles. The Strait of Hormuz is only 100 miles or so long and 24 miles wide at its narrowest point. So an F-15 can zip back and forth across the strait for hours, taking out threats as they're discovered. This combination of range and speed also allows the jet to be used for strikes deeper into Iran, as we saw with the attack on the Qom facility. Then there are the weapons: Sidewinders, AIM-120 AMRAAMs, and GBU-54 bombs attached to Joint Direct Attack munitions that can all be loaded into the F-15. And on top of that, the jet has an internally mounted M61A1 20mm 6-barrel cannon, along with 940 rounds of ammunition that it can use to tear through any Shaheed drones that Iran launches into the strait. So the F-15 is a double threat. It hits the means of drone production, as we've already seen, and then it heads back to the Strait of Hormuz to take out more of Iran's constantly dwindling supply of Shaheeds. Iran has no answer for any of this. For the US F-15s, at first that might seem like a strange claim to make, especially as the F-15 isn't a stealth fighter, and Iran has invested heavily in its air defense network. Iran's problem is that its air defenses have already been shattered. F-15s can fly almost anywhere they want on Iran's territory and above the Strait of Hormuz because the US has achieved air superiority on a level that not even its top military leaders could have expected so early into Operation Epic Fury. That air superiority is such that Iran has been reduced to using an air defense strategy described by the national interest as shoot and scoot. This means that rather than the layered network the regime thought it could rely on, all Iran can do now is wheel out isolated mobile air defenses, rattle off a missile, and run away, while hoping that the missile connects. Iran has been claiming that this has happened at least once against America's F-15s, and we'll be covering that toward the end of the video. But what this shows us is that Iran's air defense network is essentially dismantled. The US and its F-15s still have to be careful. Isolated air defense systems can still be dangerous, but there's a reason why the US has flown over 8,000 sorties in Iranian airspace since it launched the operation, as Central Command Head Admiral Brad Cooper revealed on March 21st. Iran has not been able to stop the US. It can't, as its air defenses have been destroyed, which opens the way for F-15s to do their business on the mainland and the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, the US is able to move on to its next phase of Operation Epic Fury, which includes F-15 strikes against production facilities, because those facilities are no longer being guarded. As we said earlier, the US first took out what Iran already had, and now it's focusing on what Iran wants to build. But there is a pinprick of light at the end of a very long tunnel for Iran's regime. A chance for it to get out of the mess that it's found itself in, and once again, it has everything to do with the Strait of Hormuz. On March 22nd, US President Donald Trump announced that Iran had 48 hours to stop its attacks in the Strait of Hormuz, or the US would start bombing the country's energy infrastructure. You might think that this could be enough of a threat to Iran to make it think twice about what it's doing, especially because it knows firsthand that America's F-15s are waiting, and that they will be more than capable of hitting Iran's energy infrastructure, as they've been hitting its production facilities over the past few days. And the day after delivering his deadline, Trump took to Truth Social to deliver a message in all caps, suggesting that talks between the two countries have been ongoing for a couple of days. I've instructed the Department of War to postpone any and all military strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for a 5-day period, subject to the success of the ongoing meetings and discussions, Trump declared, suggesting that the end may be near for Operation Epic Fury. But Iran had to go and mess it all up. In its desperation, and we'll be exploring just how desperate Iran has become in a moment, Iran has continued to threaten ships attempting to move through the Strait of Hormuz. Beyond that, Iran's most recent attempt to act powerfully, while not doing what Trump has told the regime to do, is to start charging fees of up to $2 million for ships to pass through the strait. This isn't the clearing of the blockade that the US has demanded, and Iran hasn't helped its own case by also claiming that it will strike back against regional powers in response to any attacks on its energy infrastructure. Iran has interpreted the US extending a small olive branch as a sign of weakness. Its regime has misread the situation and responded with threats and bombast. The US knows how desperate Iran is to avoid more F-15 bombardments. It sees the reality, which is that Iran has been forced to resort to attacks against civilian ships because the regime knows that it can't do much of anything against the US in its superior air power. Cooper said as much on March 23rd, stating, "They're operating in a sign of desperation. In the last couple of weeks, they've attacked civilian targets very deliberately, more than 300 times." Iran's regime may also be crawling close to the point where its focus on hitting civilians, be they on merchant ships, in other Gulf states, or in its own territory, could lead to an uprising. Fighter jets and bombers, including the F-15, have devastated so much of Iran's military strength. Now we may just be weeks away from an uprising, Iran International reported on March 24th. Already weakened by the economic crisis that prompted the protests that sparked this entire conflict, Iran's regime has had to watch as its strength crumbles. The US proved how weak it was militarily, and its economy has been crippled even further. The uprising hasn't come yet, Iran International says, but it adds that the tipping point for Iran's regime may have already come. And it points out that oppressed people rarely move upon sensing the first sign of weakness in a regime. They move when command is thinner, when leadership is destroyed, when the infrastructure and production that keep the regime in place are shattered. The first two criteria have already been fulfilled in Operation Epic Fury. And now that F-15s are flying sorties all over Iran, the infrastructure and production facilities that keep Iran's regime in power are starting to crumble. Quiet streets right now aren't a sign that Iran's people have submitted. They may just be waiting for the right opportunity to strike, and that opportunity may come after yet another F-15 sortie takes out yet more of the means of production that Iran uses to oppress its own people, as much as it uses to build drones and weapons for attacking those outside of its borders. Maybe the hints of this uprising brewing are why Iran is making even more desperate moves. The country's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi has reportedly signaled that his country is ready to make a deal, and that he has received permission from Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei to close the issue quickly. How true that is and how serious Iran's more fundamental sects are about such a deal is yet to be seen, especially if the deal requires concessions to be made in the Strait of Hormuz. The gap between the US and Iran still seems to be large enough to make Araghchi's words seem empty, but the fact that he's saying them at all shows us that Iran is still looking for a way out of this fight. That might be surprising if you've heard about what Iran is claiming to have done to the very type of airframe we've discussed in this video. On March 22nd, reports started circulating in Iranian media that Iran's air defenses had managed to shoot down an F-15. The message being delivered couldn't be clearer. As hard as the US has hit Iran, its air defenses could still take down one of the most important fighter jets in the US arsenal. However, not all is as it seems, as US Central Command said in a revealing X post published on the same day that the report surfaced. This is what the US Central Command had to say. False. Rumors claim the Iranian regime recently shot down a US F-15 over Iran. True, US forces have flown more than 8,000 combat sorties during Operation Epic Fury. No US fighter aircraft have been shot down by Iran. Iran is lying about the destroyed F-15. Again, this is all desperation. Iran's regime is faking victories and telling lies to make itself seem strong to its own people in the face of US aggression. That strength is being projected to quell the burgeoning uprising that the regime knows is coming, and at the same time, as F-15s fly unhindered in Iranian airspace, the country's politicians are signaling that they want an end to it all. The US holds all of the cards in Iran, and with its F-15s, it's dealing those cards one explosive strike at a time. Production facilities are now going up in smoke all over Iran, including those built to support Iran's Shaheed swarms. America's F-15s, none of which have been shot down, are at the center of it all. And to add insult to injury, those very fighter jets are also perfectly suited to patrolling the Strait of Hormuz, where they'll take out drones, missiles, and military nodes all across the strait. Iran is facing an unstoppable monster of an airframe. All that it can do is lie about success while it signals to the US that it's finally ready to talk. And the craziest thing is that F-15s aren't the only weapons that the US can use against Iran's Shaheed forces. A helping hand has been extended, and it comes from Ukraine. That helping hand is holding interceptor drones that are cheaper than any other defenses that the US has against the Shaheeds. With these drones, the US can stop the Shaheeds over the Strait of Hormuz, while its F-15s pound more production facilities. You can find out all about what Ukraine is doing if you watch our video. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to keep up with our coverage of Operation Epic Fury. And thank you as always for watching.